This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Are we marking a real turning point in American history with Trump-era prosperity, as evidenced by the GDP number announced on Friday, 4.1%, as well as tracking for 3% growth this year, confounding all of the experts who thought that Trump would tank the market and tank the economy were he to be elected president.
And I like my paycheck, don't you?
I like any paycheck. Yeah.
Every other Friday is a good day.
That's right. Also, remember the new normal under Obama and to some extent Bush was to be anemic growth because we're a declining power. Well, that feeling has somewhat changed. Larry Kudlow certainly is a hope growth and opportunity optimist, and he explained his view on the GDP number, its import, on Face the Nation over the weekend.
The basics of this number were consumer spending and business investment. Those are the basics of any number, C plus I, to put it in economic terms. It's doing terrific. It's rising by better than 4%, as was the overall. And I know some people have tried to downgrade this by saying about the tariffs, buy ahead of tariffs. By the way, we don't know that. There's a lot of theories about that. I'm glad to see exports rising, whatever the reason. The biggest thing that nobody's talked about in terms of these smaller issues is inventories. Inventories fell by, I think, $25 billion. That's very unusual. It took at least a percentage point off of GDP. But these things jump around a lot. The heart of this report, as I said, consumer spending, business investment are on a tear. Business investment is on a tear, which was really what our tax cuts were designed to do.
And your deregulation.
And the deregulation, thank you, and the energy. And by the way, the president's attitude, the war against business is over. The war against success is over. The war against energy is over. But then he's got a trade war.
Now, on the other side, David Brooks, a Trump skeptic, while he conceded that the president gets credit for a good number, presidents get credit when the economy is doing well, and they get blamed when it's not. But he suggested there are two tracks that are problematic with Trump when it comes to the economy and pretty much everything else.
You notice two things when people talking with people, especially in the business community from around the world. The first is the U.S. is now becoming like this black hole that they just don't want to get involved. And there are plenty of ways to invest in China. There's plenty of ways to invest in Africa or Europe or Asia. So why get involved in the U.S.? And as a result, foreign direct investment is plummeting here.
You mean because of the controversy?
They just don't want to be involved with Trump. Yeah. They just don't want to be in, and they get the sense that America is no longer the central nation. It's the dynamism elsewhere. The U.S. is imploding, and so we should be seeing surges of people wanting to invest here. Our economy is doing pretty good, but we're not seeing that. And second, you see this pattern of Trump, and we saw it with the EU this week, where he'll make an attack, and then he'll sort of backtrack and have a sort of peace deal, and that's sort of the drama that he likes. But it means that you can never count on him. I mean, if he does something good or do something bad, there's always going to be a backtrack. So there's just permanent instability in the U.S. presidency.
To reconcile these conflicting opinions, we're pleased to be joined by our friend, the Godfather. He is Rick Santelli, CNBC contributor, on-air editor for CNBC. Rick, thanks again for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Dan.
So trying to reconcile some of what David Brooks said, he's right. Foreign direct investment here is down year over year, but don't tell Masa-san at SoftBank, who invested $70 billion here, that. Is Brooks's channeling of the foreign investors' view of the United States correct?
Well, I'll tell you what, he brings up good points. I'm just not sure about his math because I think indirectly one of the big issues, of course, is China. And for 2016, China's direct investment into the U.S. was about $40 billion. Last year, it drifted down to about $39.5 billion. We don't have 2018 figures yet. And just to put that in perspective, last year, Canada's direct investment was $72 billion. So double basically China's. And the only reason I bring that up is that foreign direct investment by many countries actually continues to ramp up, whether it's the Middle East or parts of Europe, the Netherlands specifically. So I'm not sure that David Brooks is accurate in that. It certainly seems like a layup to say. And I also think that with respect to my ex-peer who used to work with us, Larry Kudlow, also said some things that I would have to point out I have a slightly different take on. The fact of the matter is, Dan, that when businesses globally sense that something is afoot, particularly trade negotiations, I wouldn't definitely not call it a trade war, while this is going on, they step up various activities. So I do think that the ramp up in exports is probably kind of to beat some of the tariffs by some of the local exporters, and I think the inventory numbers falling may represent that as well. Now, Larry's right, it's hard to quantify, but I certainly think that big things in the economy don't happen coincidentally, and I think the timing augurs that there's a relationship between the tariffs and businesses trying to get ahead of them or mitigate some of the pressures best they can.
Well, what about the American farmer? I mean, they're already talking about subsidies of $12 billion that they'll hand out in September. Do you feel bad for them? Are they really struggling?
I'll tell you, Amy, that is the toughest one of all, and I always have to pick my words very carefully because in a past life I did quite a bit of activity and training and consulting with various agricultural groups. One of my operations was very heavily involved in agricultural trading. The point is that if you take a step back in the big picture and you look at global demand, for example, for soybeans, then you look at global supply for soybeans, what you would find is that they're pretty evenly matched. There's huge demand in the globe. So what we're really doing is rearranging whose soybeans go to who. So if somebody switches out the U.S. because they have a beef with us like China, we'll just play musical chairs. And whatever those beans come from now, they're obviously being taken from another customer that will become our customer. So I don't know that it's as horrible as it's made out to be. Now, granted, if you're a bean farmer, you want to know as your field starts to grow and you see all your money invested start sprouting and maturing, that it's going to have an export home, and that home may be in question, but only in question as to the destination. It's going to be sold. There's demand, and I think the $12 billion, there's definitely a little politics in that because the government has so many programs that could help in this regard that were already established.
Sticking with China, which is largely what we're talking about when we talk about soybeans and some ag products, there's an interesting piece. We always look at this complicated relationship from the U.S. perspective. What about the Chinese perspective and perhaps some missteps they have made that could be to our benefit? There's a really interesting piece in the South China Morning Post about essentially arguing that Beijing got Trump wrong. They thought that his attitude towards China with respect to tariffs and fair trade, I guess to borrow a phrase, was a bluff. And now they don't think it's so much a bluff. They talk about, do the authors of this piece, which shouldn't come as a surprise to us, but that there are very few people that will tell Beijing no. And so they sort of are in their own bubble. They discourage policy advisors from having in-depth discussions with their U.S. counterparts, and so that has led to a misunderstanding or an ignorance of the latest thinking in Washington. And I just wonder if the Trump calling the China's bluff on this topic, may generate what Larry Kudlow suggests, which is ultimately in the medium term we get to a lower tariff environment, or we get to an escalating trade negotiation that metastasizes into a war. I mean, where are you in terms of the feel for which direction this is going?
Well, I think if there's a category for those who misunderstand this president, whether individuals, companies, or countries, that list is much longer than just China, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And when it comes to your question directly, my own feeling is that this is if it turns into more of a skirmish/war with regard to trade, there's no doubt in anybody's mind who will win. So when you hear many pundits say nobody wins a trade war, I'm not sure that that's particularly true. It does represent some truth insofar as both sides will lose some activity, just like when a company or workers go on strike. But the eventual prize will go to the U.S. just by the sheer numbers of how little exports from other countries imported into our country affect our economy. We're still the main consumption-driven economy in the world, which means anywhere from 2/3 to a higher percentage of our economic activity is our own consumption with regard to we're not an export economy like Germany, like China, which is a big chunk of their GDP. So we will win this. It's just a matter of how long it takes and how much pain in various sectors it inflicts and how that pain maybe translates into changing political landscape.
As you look ahead at the next 24 months, what are the areas of greatest concern to you in terms of the stability or the growth potential of the U.S. economy? Is it a particular debt load in a sector, like, say, the public sector or student loan? Is it re-blowing up the housing bubble? What concerns you?
You know, Dan, all those are definitely turnstiles of some worry beads, but without a doubt, the top of the mountain worry in my mind, and I never take my eye off the ball. These other issues come and go, and I'm not dismissing them. They're all important. But how central banks reverse a decade of very strange, one-off, first-time ever seen policy, like the Bank of Japan owning a good chunk of all the companies in their economy and their major stock indices, owning securities, central banks like ours having huge inventory of securities, all the programs to control interest rates, manage interest rates, manipulate interest rates. All this is starting to get unwound. Our central bank is way ahead of the pack in that regard. And by the way, today's the first day of a two-day Federal Open Market Committee meeting, our central bank. But that's what worries me the most. This has been the grandest experiment of monetary policy of all time, and we have no idea exactly how it's going to end or the unintended consequences we will experience as this starts to peel back the onion of a decade worth of stimulus post-crisis.
He's the Godfather, on-air editor for CNBC, Rick Santelli. Rick, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
My pleasure, Dan. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.